I stared at the envelope in my trembling hands, knowing this moment would change everything. My parents sat across from me in their worn-out recliners, demanding 50% of my salary like vultures circling fresh prey. For 28 years, I had watched them choose laziness over responsibility, excuses over effort. They had never worked a single honest day while I scraped and clawed my way to success. Now they wanted half of everything I had earned, through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. They had no idea what that envelope contained. The weight of that envelope brought back memories I had spent years trying to forget. Growing up in our rundown house on Maple Street in suburban Cleveland, Ohio, I learned early that my parents, Gary and Linda, had perfected the art of avoiding work. While other kids complained about their parents working too much, I envied them. At least their parents cared enough to provide. I was 7 when I first realized something was wrong. My classmate Tommy's mom packed him elaborate lunches with sandwiches cut into fun shapes, fresh fruit, and homemade cookies. Meanwhile, I survived on free school lunches because my parents claimed they could not afford groceries, yet somehow always had money for cigarettes and lottery tickets. Gary spent his days on the couch watching game shows, occasionally disappearing for what he called job interviews that never led to actual employment. Linda filled her time with soap operas and gossip phone calls, complaining endlessly about how hard life was while doing nothing to improve it. By age 10, I was making my own breakfast and walking the 8 blocks to school alone. Other parents dropped their kids off or waited at bus stops, but mine were still asleep when I left each morning. I learned to set my own alarm clock, lay out my own clothes, and check my own homework because asking for help only resulted in irritated sighs and promises of later that never came. The house constantly smelled of stale cigarettes and disappointment. Paint peeled from the walls, the carpet was stained beyond recognition, and half the light bulbs were burned out because replacing them required effort my parents refused to invest. I did my homework at the kitchen table under the single working overhead light, surrounded by unwashed dishes and overflowing ashtrays. When I turned 12, I started mowing lawns in the neighborhood. Mrs. Henderson next door offered me $10 to cut her grass, and word spread quickly. Soon I had 5 regular customers and was earning $50 every weekend. I used that money to buy school supplies, decent clothes from thrift stores, and occasionally treat myself to a burger when the empty refrigerator at home offered nothing but condiments and expired milk. High school brought new challenges and deeper resentment. While my friends worried about prom dates and college applications, I worried about keeping the electricity on. My parents had discovered they could live comfortably on government assistance checks, food stamps, and the occasional under-the-table work that they never reported. They mastered the system, claiming disabilities they did not have, and presenting themselves as victims of circumstances beyond their control. I worked 25 hours a week at Morrison's grocery store, stocking shelves and bagging groceries after school and on weekends. My manager, Mr. Peterson, became more of a father figure than Gary ever was, teaching me about responsibility, work ethic, and saving money. While my parents bought a new 60-inch television with their tax refund, I deposited every paycheck into a savings account earmarked for college. The day I graduated high school, with a 3.8 GPA and a partial scholarship to Ohio State University, my parents barely looked up from their shows to acknowledge my achievement. Gary muttered something about college being a waste of time, while Linda complained that I would be moving too far away. Neither bothered to attend my graduation ceremony. I sat in that auditorium surrounded by families celebrating their children's accomplishments, feeling utterly alone despite being in a crowd of hundreds. The betrayal that changed everything happened 3 weeks before I was supposed to start college. I had saved $4,000 for dormitory deposits, textbooks, and living expenses to supplement my scholarship. When I went to the bank to withdraw the money, I discovered my account was empty. My parents, listed as co-signers because I had opened the account as a minor, had cleaned it out to buy a new entertainment system complete with surround sound and gaming console. Gary shrugged when I confronted them, claiming they deserved the money for supporting me for 18 years. Linda actually had the audacity to say I should be grateful they were giving me motivation to work harder in college. They showed no remorse, no understanding of what they had stolen from me. It was not just money, it was my future, my dreams, and my trust. I left home that night with everything I owned stuffed into 2 duffel bags and $63 in cash tips from my grocery store job. I slept in my car for a week before finding a tiny studio apartment I could afford by working 40 hours a week while taking a full course load. I ate ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches for months, wore the same 3 shirts in rotation, and studied until my eyes burned. The climactic moment that brought me to this confrontation happened 2 weeks ago when I realized they had been secretly monitoring my social media accounts. Despite blocking them years earlier, they had somehow discovered my recent promotion to senior software engineer at a major tech company in Columbus. They learned about my 6-figure salary, my savings account balance, and my plans to buy a house. Their sudden interest in reconnecting was not about love or pride in my accomplishments. It was about money, and they wanted their share. 2 Saturday mornings ago, I was enjoying a rare, peaceful moment in my downtown apartment, sipping coffee and reading the news on my tablet. I had worked 60 hours that week debugging a critical system for our biggest client, and this quiet morning felt like a well-deserved reward. The sun streamed through my floor-to-ceiling windows, highlighting the modern furniture and electronics I had carefully saved to purchase. Everything in my space represented years of sacrifice and determination. The doorbell rang at 9:30, which surprised me because I was not expecting anyone. When I checked the security monitor, my blood ran cold. Gary and Linda stood in my building's lobby, looking uncomfortable but determined. Gary wore his best polo shirt, the one he reserved for court appearances and government office visits, while Linda had applied makeup and styled her hair for the first time in months. They carried cheap gas station flowers and what appeared to be a store-bought cake. Somehow they had gotten past building security, probably by following another resident through the main entrance. I buzzed them up, my mind racing with questions and dread. In the 10 years since I had left home, they had contacted me exactly 3 times. Once when Gary needed bail money after a drunk driving arrest, once when Linda wanted me to co-sign for a credit card, and once to inform me that my grandmother had died. Each interaction had been purely transactional. They entered my apartment with exaggerated amazement, commenting loudly on my success while their eyes calculated the value of everything they saw. Linda made a show of hugging me, something she had rarely done when I lived under their roof, while Gary examined my 75-inch television and leather sectional sofa with obvious envy. For the first hour, they performed an elaborate charade of parental pride. Linda praised my apartment's cleanliness and sophisticated decor, claiming she always knew I would amount to something special. Gary nodded approvingly at my computer setup and asked detailed questions about my work, suddenly interested in technology despite never owning anything more advanced than a flip phone. They devoured the expensive coffee I served, complimenting its quality while Linda casually asked about the cost. When I mentioned it was $28 a pound from a local roaster, Gary whistled appreciatively and joked about living the high life. Every comment felt like an appraisal, as if they were taking inventory of my lifestyle to calculate their potential cut. The conversation gradually shifted to more personal territory. Linda asked about my salary with the practiced casualness of someone who already knew the answer but wanted to hear me confirm it. When I deflected by saying I was doing well enough, Gary pressed harder, claiming they were just proud parents who wanted to share in their son's success. After 2 hours of this performance, they finally revealed their true purpose. Gary, with the confidence of someone presenting a reasonable business proposal, suggested that I should help my family now that I was financially successful. He emphasized the word family as if it carried some mystical obligation I had forgotten. Linda immediately began crying, pulling crumpled tissues from her purse as she described their dire financial situation. According to her tearful monologue, they were facing eviction from their apartment. Gary needed expensive dental work they could not afford, and their car was about to be repossessed. She painted a picture of desperate poverty that would have been heartbreaking if I did not know it was largely self-inflicted. The conversation reached its shocking climax when Gary, emboldened by what he perceived as my sympathetic silence, made his demand explicit. He stated matter-of-factly that I owed them 50% of my monthly salary for raising me. He presented this as simple mathematics. They had invested 28 years in my upbringing, and now it was time for their return on investment. According to Gary's twisted logic, this arrangement was not only fair but overdue. Linda supported his position by listing everything they had provided during my childhood, conveniently omitting the fact that most of it had been funded by government assistance and charity. She claimed they had sacrificed their own dreams and opportunities to ensure my success, rewriting history so dramatically that I wondered if she actually believed her own lies. The climactic twist that revealed the depth of their calculation came when Gary casually mentioned specific details about my financial situation that I had never shared with anyone. He knew the exact amount of my recent bonus, the value of my investment portfolio, and even my plans to purchase a house in the suburbs. When I asked how he possessed this information, he smiled smugly and admitted they had hired a private investigator to research my finances. My parents had not stumbled upon information about my success through social media stalking. They had paid someone to conduct surveillance on their own son, gathering intelligence like enemy operatives planning an attack. They knew not just my salary but also my savings account balance, my credit score, and my monthly expenses. They had studied my financial life more thoroughly than I studied it myself. The revelation that they had been planning this ambush for months, gathering evidence and developing strategy, transformed my shock into cold fury. This was not desperate parents reaching out for help. This was a calculated shakedown by two people who viewed me as their personal ATM machine. They had researched me like a mark in a con game, and now they expected me to pay up voluntarily. The week following their visit became a masterclass in emotional manipulation that would have impressed professional con artists. Gary and Linda launched a coordinated campaign designed to break down my resistance through guilt, shame, and social pressure. They had clearly planned this phase as carefully as their initial research. Linda called me every morning at exactly 7:15, right when she knew I would be getting ready for work. Her conversations followed the same script, sobbing about their desperate situation, reminiscing about my childhood, as if it had been filled with love and sacrifice, and expressing hurt that I was abandoning them in their hour of greatest need. She had perfected the art of the guilt trip, making herself sound like a devoted mother whose ungrateful son had forgotten where he came from. These daily phone calls were timed to disrupt my morning routine and put me in a negative mindset before important meetings. Linda knew I had presentations to give and deadlines to meet, yet she deliberately created emotional chaos that followed me into the office. When I stopped answering her calls, she left increasingly dramatic voicemails that my assistant accidentally played on speaker during a client conference call. Gary took a different approach, contacting my extended family to build a coalition of pressure. He called my aunts, uncles, and cousins, painting himself as a struggling father whose successful son had turned cold and selfish. According to Gary's version of events, I was living in luxury while my parents faced homelessness, and he was simply asking for fair assistance that any decent child would provide willingly. My cousin Jessica called me in tears, begging me to help my parents because family should stick together during hard times. My Uncle Robert sent a long email about the importance of honoring your father and mother, complete with biblical quotations and personal anecdotes about family loyalty. These relatives had no idea about my parents' true history or their pattern of exploitation, so they genuinely believed they were advocating for justice. The social media attacks began subtly, but escalated quickly. Linda posted vague Facebook messages about ungrateful children who forgot their roots once they achieved success. She shared articles about adult children who abandoned their elderly parents, adding comments like, "Some people really need to read this and learn something." Gary created fake accounts to like and share these posts, making it appear as if their position had widespread community support. Within days, their social media campaign became more direct. Linda posted a photo of herself crying next to an eviction notice, with a caption about how heartbreaking it was when your own child refused to help during your darkest hour. Gary shared stories about successful celebrities who bought their parents' houses, wondering aloud why some children appreciated their families while others forgot where they came from. The workplace harassment reached professional levels when Gary began calling my office repeatedly, claiming family emergencies that required immediate attention. He somehow obtained the direct numbers for my department and my manager, leaving messages about urgent situations that demanded my response. During one particularly important client presentation, My phone buzzed constantly with calls from numbers I did not recognize, all connected to Gary's campaign to reach me. My manager, Angela, pulled me aside after the third day of interrupted meetings to express concern about my family emergency. When I explained that there was no actual emergency, just parents demanding money, she looked confused and worried about my judgment. Gary's harassment was not only affecting my peace of mind, but also my professional reputation. The escalation continued when they began making subtle legal threats. Linda mentioned during one tearful phone call that parents had rights regarding their children's earnings, especially when those children lived in the family home for 18 years. Gary researched obscure laws about elder support and family financial obligations, finding isolated cases that he misinterpreted to support his position. They consulted with a lawyer who apparently told them they had no legal grounds for their demands, but they twisted his consultation into validation of their moral position. Gary began dropping phrases like legal remedies and family court into conversations, creating the impression that they were building a case against me. The threats were vague enough to avoid actual legal trouble, but specific enough to create anxiety. The fake medical emergency marked their most desperate and manipulative escalation. Linda called me at work sobbing about chest pains and possible heart problems that required expensive medical treatment they could not afford. She claimed their insurance had been canceled and begged me to help her get the care she needed to survive. I rushed to the hospital she named, only to discover she was not there and had never been admitted. When I called her back, she claimed the chest pains had subsided but insisted she still needed money for follow-up tests and medications. The entire medical emergency had been fabricated to create urgency and manipulate my emotions. Gary expanded their campaign to include my childhood neighbors and teachers, people who remembered me as a quiet, hard-working kid but knew nothing about my adult relationship with my parents. Mrs. Patterson, my third-grade teacher, sent me a heartfelt note about how proud she was of my success and how important it was to help family members who were struggling. Mr. Jenkins from down the street stopped me at the grocery store to express concern about my parents' financial difficulties. These community members genuinely cared about my family's welfare and had been deceived into believing my parents were innocent victims of circumstances beyond their control. Gary and Linda had crafted a narrative that cast them as hardworking people who had fallen on tough times, while portraying me as a selfish success story who had forgotten his humble beginnings. The climactic revelation that exposed the depth of their deception came when I decided to drive past their supposed apartment to see their living conditions for myself. Instead of the rundown complex they had described, I found them residing in Cedar Ridge luxury apartments, a high-end community with a swimming pool, fitness center, and concierge service. Their apartment was not the cramped, deteriorating unit they had portrayed during their guilt campaign. Through the large windows, I could see new furniture, a massive television, and what appeared to be recent renovations. The parking lot contained Gary's supposedly failing car, which had been detailed and showed no signs of mechanical problems. I spent an hour researching the apartment complex online and discovered that units there rented for $2,400 per month, far more than their claimed income could support. They had been living in luxury while claiming poverty, funding their lifestyle through credit cards, loans, and possibly fraudulent schemes I had not yet uncovered. The realization that their entire crisis was fabricated transformed my guilt into cold determination. They were not desperate parents facing legitimate hardship. They were sophisticated manipulators, running a long-term con game with me as the target. Their campaign of emotional warfare was not born from need, but from greed and entitlement. The discovery of my parents' luxury living situation shattered any remaining doubt about their true motives, but I needed concrete evidence before confronting them. I contacted Sarah Mitchell, a private investigator recommended by a colleague who had used her services during a messy divorce. Sarah specialized in financial fraud and background investigations, with 15 years of experience as a police detective before starting her own firm. Our first meeting took place in her downtown office, a professional space that immediately put me at ease. Sarah listened carefully as I explained the situation, taking detailed notes and asking pointed questions about my parents' history and behavior patterns. She did not seem surprised by their tactics, explaining that financial exploitation of successful adult children was more common than most people realized. Within a week, Sarah uncovered information that exceeded my worst expectations. My parents were not simply lazy or entitled. They were career criminals who had been running sophisticated scams for years. The evidence she gathered painted a picture of systematic fraud that extended far beyond their demands for my money. The government fraud was extensive and well organized. Gary and Linda had been illegally collecting disability benefits for fabricated conditions while working under-the-table jobs that they never reported to authorities. Gary claimed a back injury that prevented him from working, yet Sarah found evidence of him doing construction work for cash payments. Linda received mental health disability payments, while secretly babysitting neighborhood children for unreported income. Their disability fraud had been running for 7 years, generating over $200,000 in illegal benefits. They had learned to game the system expertly, knowing exactly what symptoms to report and which doctors to visit for sympathetic evaluations. They rotated between different physicians to avoid detection and had coached each other on maintaining consistent stories about their limitations. The credit card schemes revealed a level of sophistication that shocked even Sarah. My parents had been opening credit cards in the names of deceased relatives, using obituaries and public records to gather necessary information. They had successfully created accounts for my grandmother, 2 deceased uncles, and several family friends who had passed away over the previous 5 years. Each fraudulent account was managed carefully to avoid immediate detection. They made minimum payments for several months before maxing out the cards and abandoning them. The total debt accumulated through this scheme exceeded $60,000, spread across 12 different financial institutions. They had created a complex web of false identities and addresses to support their fraudulent applications. The revelation about my grandmother's exploitation was particularly devastating. Sarah discovered that Gary and Linda had been stealing her Social Security checks during the final 2 years of her life, when dementia had left her vulnerable and confused. They had gained access to her bank accounts by claiming they were helping her manage her finances, then systematically drained her savings while she lived in a state-funded nursing home. My grandmother died believing she was destitute, unaware that her own son and daughter-in-law had stolen the money she had saved for her grandchildren's education. The inheritance she had intended to leave me, approximately $15,000, had been spent on my parents' luxury lifestyle and gambling debts. They had even sold her jewelry and personal belongings without her knowledge or consent. Sarah's investigation revealed that this pattern of exploitation extended to other elderly neighbors and family friends. Mrs. Henderson, who had hired me to mow her lawn as a child, had been convinced to loan Gary $5,000 for emergency car repairs that never happened. Mr. and Mrs. Cooper from across the street had given Linda $3,000 to help with medical bills that were completely fabricated. The scope of their fraudulent activities included fake charity collections in their neighborhood. They had created official-looking donation forms for non-existent organizations supporting cancer research, homeless veterans, and disaster relief. Door-to-door collections in their own community had netted several $1,000s from trusting neighbors who believed they were supporting legitimate causes. Sarah found evidence of mail fraud, identity theft, check forgery, and tax evasion spanning over a decade. My parents had perfected their criminal enterprise while maintaining the appearance of struggling, honest people victimized by circumstances beyond their control. They had used their skills in deception to exploit everyone around them, from government agencies to elderly neighbors to their own family members. The investigation also uncovered their recent escalation into more serious crimes. They had attempted to use my personal information to apply for credit cards and loans, forging documents to make me an unwitting co-signer for debts I knew nothing about. Sarah found 3 pending applications that had been submitted using my Social Security number and employment information. The most shocking discovery was that they had already spent money they expected to receive from me. Credit card statements showed purchases of expensive electronics, furniture, and vacation packages charged against anticipated income from their demands. They had been so confident in their ability to manipulate me that they had already committed to payments based on money they had not yet extracted. The climactic revelation came when Sarah informed me that my parents were currently under FBI investigation for mail fraud and identity theft. Federal agents had been building a case against them for months, gathering evidence of their multi-state criminal activities. The timing of their demand for my money was not coincidental. They needed funds to pay for expensive criminal defense attorneys and potentially flee the country if charges were filed. Sarah explained that my parents faced potential federal charges, carrying sentences of up to 20 years in prison. Their financial crimes had crossed state lines and involved federal agencies, elevating their case from local fraud to federal prosecution. The luxury apartment, new furniture, and expensive lifestyle were funded by criminal activities that were about to catch up with them. Understanding that my parents were not just greedy, but genuinely dangerous criminals, changed my entire perspective on the situation. This was not a family dispute about money. It was an attempt by career criminals to involve me in their schemes and potentially make me an accessory to their crimes. Their demand for 50% of my salary was part of a larger criminal enterprise that threatened not just my finances but my freedom and reputation. Armed with Sarah's evidence, I realized that confronting my parents required careful planning and legal protection. This was no longer a personal family matter, but a criminal investigation that could affect my own freedom if handled incorrectly. I needed professional guidance and ironclad documentation of every interaction going forward. My first step was consulting with David Chen, an attorney who specialized in family law and financial crimes. David had handled cases involving elder abuse, identity theft, and family fraud, giving him unique insight into the legal complexities of my situation. His office was located in the financial district, and his credentials covered the wall behind his mahogany desk. David reviewed Sarah's evidence with the careful attention of someone who understood the serious nature of the crimes my parents had committed. He explained that their actions constituted multiple felonies that could result in significant prison time and financial restitution to their victims. More importantly for my immediate situation, he confirmed that I had no legal obligation to provide them with any financial support whatsoever. The attorney helped me understand the potential risks I faced if my parents continued their criminal activities. Their use of my personal information for fraudulent applications could potentially implicate me in their schemes if I did not take immediate action to protect myself. David recommended a comprehensive strategy to document their behavior and insulate me from any future criminal liability. We began by implementing protective measures for all my financial accounts and personal information. David arranged for credit monitoring services that would alert me to any attempts to use my identity for loans, credit cards, or other financial products. We placed fraud alerts with all 3 major credit bureaus and secured my social security number against unauthorized use. I changed all passwords for my bank accounts, investment portfolios, and employer systems, implementing 2-factor authentication wherever possible. David helped me draft letters to my bank, credit card companies, and employer explaining the situation and requesting additional security measures to prevent unauthorized access to my accounts. The evidence compilation required careful organization and legal documentation. Sarah and David worked together to create a comprehensive file that included photographs, financial records, witness statements, and official documents proving my parents' criminal activities. Every piece of evidence was properly authenticated and prepared for potential use in legal proceedings. David recommended setting up what he called a controlled confrontation, where my parents would be invited to my apartment under the pretense of receiving their demanded money. This meeting would be carefully documented with legal audio and video recording equipment, providing irrefutable evidence of their criminal intent and threatening behavior. The setup required precise coordination between multiple parties. Sarah would be positioned in an adjacent apartment with surveillance equipment and direct communication with local law enforcement. David arranged for FBI agents who were already investigating my parents to be ready to respond immediately if the situation escalated beyond threats to actual criminal behavior. We installed professional-grade recording equipment in my apartment that would capture both audio and video of the entire encounter. The system was completely legal under Ohio's one-party consent laws, meaning I could record conversations in my own home without my parents' knowledge or permission. Multiple camera angles would document every word and action during their visit. The envelope that would contain my response to their demands became a carefully crafted piece of evidence. Instead of money or a check, it would contain copies of all the documentation Sarah had gathered about their criminal activities, along with a letter explaining that I knew about their fraud and would not be participating in their schemes. David helped me write the letter in language that was clear but legally precise. It informed my parents that I was aware of their criminal activities, would not provide them with any financial assistance, and expected them to cease all contact with me immediately. The letter also warned them that any future attempts to use my personal information or harass me would result in immediate law enforcement involvement. The backup plan included immediate law enforcement contact if my parents became violent or made specific threats against me. Sarah had coordinated with Detective Rodriguez from the Columbus Police Department, who was liaising with the FBI investigation into my parents' activities. Any escalation during our meeting would trigger immediate police response and potential arrest. We also prepared for the possibility that my parents might attempt to destroy evidence or flee after realizing they had been caught. Sarah had already provided copies of all evidence to federal investigators, so nothing they could do during our confrontation would affect the ongoing criminal case against them. Their crimes were already documented, and their prosecution was inevitable. The timing of our confrontation was coordinated with the FBI investigation to ensure maximum impact. Federal agents wanted to observe my parents' reaction to being exposed, gathering additional evidence of their criminal mindset and lack of remorse for their actions. Our meeting would provide the final piece of evidence needed to complete their case. The climactic twist that elevated our plan from defensive to offensive came when Sarah discovered that my parents had already told their neighbors and extended family that I had agreed to give them the money. They had been posting on social media about their upcoming windfall, thanking me publicly for my generosity and promising to share details about their good fortune. More seriously, they had secretly applied for a $30,000 personal loan using my financial information as collateral. They had forged my signature on application documents and provided my employer information and salary details to support their loan request. The loan approval was pending, meaning they were on the verge of committing a major felony that would directly implicate me in their criminal activities. This discovery transformed our confrontation from a family dispute resolution into an urgent intervention to prevent additional crimes. We needed to expose their activities immediately, before they could complete the fraudulent loan application or use my reputation to commit additional fraud against other victims. David filed emergency motions with the court to freeze any financial accounts linked to my identity and alert all relevant financial institutions about the fraudulent applications. We also provided federal investigators with evidence of the attempted loan fraud, giving them grounds for immediate arrest if my parents completed the fraudulent application. The plan reached its final form as a carefully orchestrated intervention designed to end my parents' criminal activities while protecting me from any collateral damage. Every detail had been considered, from legal documentation to personal safety, ensuring that justice would be served regardless of how my parents reacted to being exposed. The evening of our planned confrontation arrived with unseasonable warmth for October in Columbus. My parents were scheduled to arrive at 7 o'clock, expecting to collect their first monthly payment of what they believed would be a permanent arrangement. I had spent the day reviewing our plan with Sarah and David, ensuring that every detail was perfectly coordinated. Gary and Linda arrived 15 minutes early, carrying a bottle of cheap champagne and wearing their best clothes, as if this was a celebration rather than an extortion attempt. Linda had applied makeup carefully and styled her hair, while Gary wore the same suit he had worn to court appearances over the years. They entered my apartment with the confidence of people who believed they had already won. Their performance began immediately, with Linda taking selfies in front of my expensive furniture and Gary commenting loudly about how proud they were of my success. They insisted on opening the champagne, toasting to family and financial partnership, while their eyes gleamed with anticipated greed. Linda posted photos on social media in real time, captioning them with messages about family reunions and shared prosperity. For the first hour, they maintained their charade of loving parents, celebrating their son's generosity. Gary examined my electronics with newfound interest, asking detailed questions about prices and features, as if calculating his share of ownership. Linda wandered through my apartment taking pictures, already planning how she would decorate their new luxury lifestyle funded by my monthly payments. They brought up specific plans for the money, revealing just how thoroughly they had prepared for this moment. Gary wanted to buy a new truck and take a vacation to Las Vegas, while Linda had already researched expensive jewelry and designer clothing she planned to purchase. They discussed their financial demands as if they were business partners dividing profits rather than parents exploiting their child. The celebration atmosphere began to shift when I delayed producing the envelope they had come to collect. Their casual conversation became increasingly forced as they realized I was not immediately complying with their expectations. Gary's jokes about early retirement became pointed comments about family obligations, while Linda's loving remarks carried underlying threats about disappointment and consequences. When I began asking questions about their recent lifestyle improvements and financial situation, their carefully maintained masks began to slip. Gary became defensive about their luxury apartment, claiming they had received an inheritance from a distant relative I had never heard of. Linda's explanations for their expensive purchases grew increasingly elaborate and contradictory. Their true personalities emerged as frustration replaced false affection. Gary's voice rose as he accused me of stalling and wasting their time, while Linda's tears transformed from grateful joy to manipulative anger. They dropped their pretense of this being a voluntary family arrangement and began making explicit threats about what would happen if I refused to pay. The verbal abuse escalated quickly once they realized their emotional manipulation was not working. Gary called me selfish and ungrateful, listing everything they claimed to have sacrificed during my childhood while conveniently ignoring the government assistance that had actually funded my upbringing. Linda accused me of thinking I was better than my family and threatened to tell everyone what kind of son I really was. Their threats became more specific and dangerous as their desperation increased. Gary mentioned that successful people had accidents all the time, while Linda suggested that my employer might be interested to learn about my family problems. They were no longer asking for money but demanding it, making it clear that refusal was not an option they would accept peacefully. The moment of truth arrived when I finally presented them with the envelope they had been demanding. Their faces lit up with triumphant greed as Gary reached for what he believed was their first payment. Linda actually clapped her hands together, already counting money she had not yet seen. Gary tore open the envelope eagerly, his smile fading as he realized it contained documents rather than cash or a check. The confusion on his face transformed into shock as he recognized some of the evidence Sarah had gathered about their criminal activities. Linda peered over his shoulder, her makeup-streaked face going pale as she understood what she was seeing. The envelope contained copies of bank records showing their fraudulent disability claims, photographs of them performing work they claimed to be unable to do, documentation of their credit card fraud using deceased relatives' identities, and evidence of their theft from my grandmother and elderly neighbors. Every crime they had committed over the past decade was documented in explicit detail. My letter explaining that I knew about their criminal activities and would not be providing them with any money was clipped to the front of the evidence packet. As they read my words, their shock transformed into panic and rage. Gary began shouting about invasion of privacy and illegal surveillance, while Linda screamed accusations about ungrateful children and family betrayal. Their panic reached its peak when they realized the implications of being exposed. Gary attempted to tear up the documents, not understanding that we had provided copies to federal investigators months earlier. Linda threatened to call the police, not realizing that law enforcement was already aware of their crimes and building a case against them. The climactic moment arrived when Gary lunged toward me in a rage, shouting threats about what he would do to ungrateful sons who betrayed their families. His advance was stopped by a firm knock on my apartment door, followed by the authoritative voice of FBI Special Agent Patricia Williams announcing federal law enforcement. Sarah had been monitoring our conversation from the adjacent apartment and had signaled federal agents when my parents' behavior escalated to physical threats. The timing was perfect, catching Gary and Linda in the act of attempting to intimidate a witness in a federal criminal investigation. Agent Williams entered my apartment with 2 other federal agents, badges clearly visible as they immediately took control of the situation. Gary and Linda's shock was complete, as they realized they were not just dealing with family conflict but with federal law enforcement. Their attempts to destroy evidence and intimidate me had been witnessed and documented by professional investigators. The arrest was swift and professional, with agents reading my parents their Miranda rights while they sputtered confused protests about family disputes and misunderstandings. Gary demanded to speak to a lawyer, while Linda continued crying and claiming they had done nothing wrong. Neither seemed to fully comprehend that their years of criminal activity had finally caught up with them. As federal agents led my parents away in handcuffs, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief mixed with sadness. The people who should have loved and supported me unconditionally had chosen crime and exploitation over family bonds. Their arrest was not a victory, but a necessary ending to a relationship that had been built on manipulation and abuse. 6 months after my parents' arrest, I stood in my new house in the suburbs of Columbus, reading a letter that would change my perspective on family, forgiveness, and the power of making positive choices despite painful circumstances. The letter was from Jennifer Martinez, a 19-year-old freshman at Ohio State University who had received the first scholarship from the foundation I had established to help children from dysfunctional families pursue higher education. The legal outcomes for Gary and Linda had been swift and decisive. Faced with overwhelming evidence of their criminal activities, they had accepted plea agreements rather than risk lengthy prison sentences after trial. Gary received 4 years in federal prison for mail fraud, identity theft, and government benefits fraud. Linda was sentenced to 3 years for her role in the same crimes, plus an additional year for elder abuse related to their exploitation of my grandmother. The federal court also ordered them to pay full restitution to their victims, including the government agencies they had defrauded and the elderly neighbors they had exploited. The total restitution amount exceeded $300,000, money they would never be able to repay in their lifetimes. Their assets, including the luxury apartment furnishings and expensive electronics, were seized and sold to partially compensate their victims. During their sentencing hearing, I chose to attend and provide a victim impact statement. Standing before the federal judge, I explained how their lifelong pattern of manipulation and exploitation had affected not just me, but everyone who had tried to help them over the years. I described the elderly neighbors they had swindled, the government programs they had abused, and the trust they had betrayed in pursuit of easy money. The judge listened carefully to my statement before delivering sentences that reflected the serious nature of their crimes. She noted that Gary and Linda had shown no remorse for their actions and had attempted to blame their victims for their own criminal choices. Their lack of accountability and continued attempts to manipulate the system even during their trial demonstrated that prison time was necessary to protect society from their fraudulent behavior. The financial recovery process revealed the full extent of my parents' criminal enterprise. Federal investigators recovered evidence of fraud dating back 15 years, involving dozens of victims and multiple government agencies. My grandmother's stolen inheritance was partially recovered from seized assets, allowing me to establish a memorial fund in her honor that would support educational opportunities for deserving students. Personal healing became a priority as I worked with Dr. Rachel Thompson, a therapist who specialized in family trauma and emotional abuse. Our sessions helped me understand that my parents' behavior was not a reflection of my worth or their love for me, but rather a manifestation of their own character defects and criminal mindset. Learning to separate their choices from my identity was crucial for my emotional recovery. The therapy process revealed patterns of manipulation and emotional abuse that had been present throughout my childhood but that I had normalized due to my circumstances. Dr. Thompson helped me recognize that healthy families support each other's growth and celebrate each other's success, rather than viewing family members as resources to be exploited. Understanding what normal family relationships looked like was both liberating and heartbreaking. My extended family members, who had initially pressured me to help my parents, gradually learned the truth about Gary and Linda's criminal activities. My cousin Jessica apologized tearfully for questioning my judgment, while my Uncle Robert expressed shock and remorse for his earlier criticism. These family members became sources of genuine support as I worked to build healthier relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation. The community support that emerged after my parents' arrest was overwhelming and unexpected. Mrs. Henderson and other elderly neighbors who had been victimized by their scams thanked me for exposing their criminal activities. Several of them had been too embarrassed to report being swindled, but my willingness to confront my parents gave them courage to seek justice for themselves. My professional life flourished as I channeled my energy into meaningful work rather than managing family crisis and manipulation. Angela, my manager, noted significant improvements in my focus and productivity once the distraction of my parents' harassment was eliminated. I received another promotion within 6 months, recognizing both my technical skills and my ability to handle complex challenges under pressure. Building healthy relationships became a priority as I learned to recognize the difference between people who cared about my well-being and those who were interested in what I could provide for them. My new girlfriend, Amanda, was a teacher who valued education and hard work, supporting my foundation work while pursuing her own career goals. Our relationship was built on mutual respect and shared values rather than financial transaction or emotional manipulation. The scholarship foundation grew beyond my original vision, as other successful professionals contributed funding to expand our reach. We provided not just financial assistance for college, but also mentoring and emotional support for students from troubled family backgrounds. Understanding that educational opportunity alone was not enough, we helped students develop the life skills and emotional resilience needed to break cycles of dysfunction. Gary and Linda's time in federal prison brought unexpected developments in their personal growth and accountability. After 18 months of incarceration, Linda wrote me a letter acknowledging her criminal behavior and expressing genuine remorse for the pain she had caused. Her letter was not a request for money or early release, but a sincere apology that recognized the harm she had inflicted on me and other victims. Gary's transformation took longer, but eventually he also wrote to express understanding of how his choices had damaged our family and hurt innocent people. His letter included detailed information about other crimes he and Linda had committed that had never been discovered, allowing law enforcement to provide closure for additional victims. Both letters demonstrated genuine accountability and personal growth that years of manipulation and threats had never achieved. The foundation's impact expanded beyond individual scholarships to become a voice for children who were being exploited by their own families. We partnered with law enforcement agencies to educate the public about financial abuse of young adults and help develop resources for people escaping dysfunctional family situations. My personal experience became a tool for helping others recognize and address similar problems in their own lives. The deep life lesson that emerged from this painful experience transformed my understanding of family, love, and personal responsibility. I learned that true family relationships are built on love, support, and mutual respect, not blood relation or obligation. The people who celebrate your success and support your growth are your real family, regardless of biological connection. Most importantly, I discovered that refusing to enable someone's destructive behavior is actually an act of love, both for yourself and for them. By refusing to fund my parents' criminal lifestyle, I forced them to face consequences that ultimately led to personal growth and accountability. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the opportunity to face the results of their choices. The ripple effect of standing up to exploitation extended far beyond my personal situation. Jennifer's scholarship letter thanked me not just for the financial assistance, but for showing her that it was possible to succeed despite family dysfunction. She wrote about breaking the cycle of poverty and poor choices that had affected her family for generations, using education as a tool for transformation. Today, as I prepare to move into my new house and continue expanding the scholarship foundation, I feel a sense of peace and purpose that was impossible when I was trapped in my parents' web of manipulation. The envelope that contained evidence of their crimes represented not just the end of their exploitation, but the beginning of a life built on authentic relationships and meaningful contribution to others. My story demonstrates that family relationships should enhance your life, rather than drain your resources and energy. When family members view you as an opportunity for financial gain rather than someone to love and support, you have both the right and responsibility to protect yourself. Setting boundaries with exploitative relatives is not selfishness, but self-preservation. The transformation of my parents from criminals to people capable of genuine accountability shows that even the most damaged relationships can potentially be healed when consequences force honest self-examination. However, that healing must be based on their choices and growth, not your willingness to continue enabling their destructive behavior. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and protecting yourself from exploitation? How did you find the courage to set boundaries with people who claim to love you, but treated you like an ATM machine. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe to hear more stories about overcoming family dysfunction and building authentic relationships. Share this video with anyone who might be struggling with similar family manipulation, and remember that you have the power to break cycles of exploitation and create the life you deserve. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it helps you find the strength to stand up for yourself when family members forget that love should be given freely, not purchased with guilt and obligation. Remember that your success belongs to you, and you have every right to protect it from those who would exploit your achievements for their own gain.